All right, so welcome to our Lunch and Learn training on reactive attachment disorder. And I'm super, super excited to have Lynn Moyer from Children and Families First joining us. So Lynn, I'll turn it over to you. Introduce yourself and get started.
Sure. So thanks for joining. If you guys are eating lunch, while we do this, feel free. Doesn't bother me. Do whatever you need to do. We all have to multitask to get everything done. So I work for Children and Families First, a nonprofit here in Delaware. I am in the foster care and adoption unit, based out of Newcastle County, but I am statewide. I do a variety of functions. I am not a case manager for foster care families. I work in my functions include the My Life program, if you're familiar with that, family search and engagement, child specific recruitment. I also work with birth families at different times, and then, kind of like a mishmash of other things. But this topic is actually a really important topic for us to talk about. And you folks being CASAs are in a very unique position to help children who have been given this diagnosis or are in the process of being given this diagnosis. So I'm really happy that, I was able to share my perspective and some information with you. So I am going to screen share. I am not the best with technology. So Lauren is here to make sure I don't send you out into cyberspace, never to return. So if you could just tell me if you can see that, give me a thumbs up or something, that would be awesome. Okay, yep. Great. So let's see. So we're going to talk about what is reactive attachment disorder and what we can do to help children diagnosed with attachment disorders. We really want kids to thrive. If there's a takeaway from here, it's kind of two parts. One is that you are in a very unique position to help children who have this diagnosis or are suspected of having this diagnosis. And it is also really important that you use that position to advocate for what these children really need. We don't want to think of this as something that is like a black mark against them or, a definitive endpoint. We want to think of this as something in process. Okay, so let's see. How do I... Wait, is there a way, Lauren, to make this like screen, what do you call it? Like,
so yeah, like a full screen. So I'm not entirely sure because you're actually sharing it as a PDF. So
great.
It's actually the PDF, not the PowerPoint. So you'll have to just scroll down to get to the
I'm just going to scroll, and I apologize. This is why I need help with technology. So, okay. So here's our agenda for today. We want to talk about what is reactive attachment disorder. How prevalent is it in foster care and adoption? What can cause children to develop struggles with attachment and end up with a diagnosis of RAD? Can children with RAD be helped? And what skills and services are helpful should a child have a diagnosis of RAD? And then your role as a CASA. So let's just start with what is RAD. So children with reactive attachment disorder are severely impeded in their ability to bond with their caregivers during their first years of life due to their circumstances. That is the critical piece that I really want you to take away. It is not their fault. And you'll find that sometimes when children are given a diagnosis of reactive attachment disorder, a lot of blame is put on the child. And it would be, do you see that when that pops up, that thing I just clicked out of the way?
Nope.
No. Okay. Sorry. It's my email or something. So, okay. So, we really want to get away from that. And we want to think about it as the circumstances that has created this impediment to their ability to form attachment. It is not something that is wrong with the child. It is something that has happened to the child. And that's a really different mind shift in order to keep in mind. And as a result, children can be chronically mistrustful, hypervigilant, and defensive when adults try to get close enough to be attachment figures. Those are really important things to keep in mind. They are mistrustful, hypervigilant, and defensive. These are behaviors, survival behaviors that they have learned in order to protect themselves as a result of the circumstances that they have experienced. This is not a character flaw. This is not something wrong with them. So again, we want to try to keep that mind shift in mind. So we cannot talk about reactive attachment disorders if we don't talk about the attachment cycle. I don't know how familiar you are with it, but I just want to look at this because you have to understand this in order to understand what has happened, what the circumstances are that has caused this child to either be suspected or diagnosed with reactive attachment disorders. So when you have this word normal, we try to get away from the word normal. It's typical. So you have typical child trust building cycle. So we know when a baby is born, the babies express a need. And when babies are first born, everything's a 10, right? On a scale of 1 to 10, everything's a 10. They react the same way, whether they are wet, hungry, want to be picked up. It doesn't matter. Everything's a 10. And they express that need. So at the top here, we see the baby has a need, and then we go over here to the baby cries. So they're now hollering. They at a level 10, and then the caregiver runs to meet that need. Right? They run over. They pick up the baby. They coo. They say it's going to be okay. They try to figure out what is the need. Is the baby wet? Is the baby hungry? Does the baby just want to be picked up? What is causing that distress? Then when the caregiver meets that need, when the caregiver changes the diaper, feeds the baby, rocks the baby, the trust develops. Okay, and then the child can calm down again. They regulate, and until they have their next need. And this happens over and over and over and over. If you've had any experience with infants at all, this is not a one and done process. This happens over and over, and the caregiver, the attuned caregiver meets the need, and the trust develops. So if you're looking at infant trauma, the child has a need, the baby cries, it's a 10, right? They're hungry, they're wet, they want to be picked up, and the need is not met by an attuned caregiver. Okay, we want to use that word attuned. That is super important to understand. That if the caregiver needs to be attuned to the child and learn the child, learn to anticipate the needs. If you've had experience with an infant, you know that after a while, when you've been with the infant, when you start to distinguish the cries, right? Oh, that's the hungry cry. That's the wet cry. That's the I need you to cuddle me cry. So you start to become attuned, and you start to understand what the child's need is. But if the need is not met by the caregiver, then mistrust develops. And if this happens over and over and over again, the child learns that the world is not a safe place. They cannot depend on adult caregivers to meet their needs. And they start to make a switch in their brain development. A lot of this is based on brain science, which is really critical to understand. We don't have time to get into it. I will mention some of the neurobiology as we go on, but you need to understand this is brain science based, because that helps with the shift, and it helps in your discussions with people to move the shift from blaming the child. Okay, because we have to understand that during this infancy, neural pathways are developed. Okay, and if a child has typical caregiver needs met by a caregiver, then their neural pathways form in one way, and if they don't, their neural pathways can form in a different way. Okay, so that's a really thing to remember. It's that repeated caregiving that makes a difference. This is a very repetitious cycle. And we want to, again, think of that word attuned, because we want to get away from that word loving, because people will say, oh, if their needs are met by a loving caregiver. Okay, so in, foster care and adoption, it is rare, not 100%, but rare for a caregiver to not love their child, for a parent to not love their child. They may not be attuned to the child. They may not be able to meet the child's needs. They may not be able to parent the child, but it is very rare they don't love the child. So we have to understand this is not because a caregiver is not loving. It is because they are not attuned to the child. They are not able to meet the child's needs. So as I said, we're talking a little bit about the neurobiology of this. Please know there is a lot of brain science attached to this. There's a lot of wonderful resources out there. There are a lot of wonderful speakers. It is really good to educate yourself on brain science and trauma. This comes into play because if we don't look at the brain science, we're not looking at the nerve development of the child's brain. And we can, again, blame the child that this is their fault, that there's a lot of words that we'll get into that are used to describe children who have not had secure attachment as infancy. And it's all very focused on blaming the child. So the structural development of a child's brain can be impacted by their early life experiences. The neuroreceptive system can develop a bias for detecting threats from adults, causing them to become compulsively self-reliant. That is a key word, compulsively self-reliant. These are survival skills for a child that they develop. When we look at inappropriate behavior that children can exhibit, kids who are in foster care, and in the penal system, we really need to understand that these are survival skills they have developed. Those maladaptive behaviors made sense to them for survival at some point. Maybe it's not the best way to get their needs met now. Maybe it's not serving the purpose that they originally had developed them, but they had to rely on them for a reason. So if we can look at what are the perceptions and beliefs that are driving that behavior, then we have a better understanding of what is going on. So learning to live defensively creates this term called blocked trust and safety blindness, which makes it hard for a child to see, hear, feel signs of safety in relationships with caregivers. This is when we get into why, when a child joins a foster family or an adoptive family, when they join a resource family, why do they not recognize that that family is safe for them? And why does their defensive behaviors continue? And it's because they have developed this thing called blocked trust, where they just cannot hear, see, or feel those signs of safety. They are, as we mentioned a minute ago, hypervigilant and defensive in order to protect their survival. This is what they have developed. So attachment is important to infants when they're born. Infants are born helpless, and they are dependent 100% on caregivers in order to survive. So this is not just something that is like a byproduct or secondary. This is attachment is important to an infant's survival. So when a child creates this blocked trust and safety blindness, again, these are stemming out of their survival skills and what they're trying to do in order to get their needs met. This compulsively self-reliant concept. Okay, so when a child joins a family and is in this blocked trust defensive mode, the caregiver can experience that. The resource parent can experience that as not very pleasant, right? They do a lot for the child, and they put a lot of time and effort into, creating a safe and stable environment for this child, and they're not getting much out of it, right? They're not getting anything back. In typical infant development, when a child screams and they're a level 10 and we pick them up and we meet that need, then we get the reinforcement from the baby, right? They smile, they coo, they give you all those like wonderful little baby signals, and that helps the caregiver bond to the child. So when a child joins a resource family and the resource parents are not getting anything back from the child, when they're giving, or their feeling is that they're giving, and they're not getting that reinforcement back, the child isn't grateful, the child isn't polite, the child isn't pleasant to be around, right? We have that saying, it's hard to hug a porcupine. So it can create in a resource parent, what's called blocked care. So now you have kind of a cycle of where the child has blocked trust, which has then the resource parent has developed blocked care. And now we have, we're leading towards, you know, the disruptions, where the family's like, you know, this child's not grateful, or this child's too disrespectful, or this child has behavior that makes me uncomfortable. They're not getting what they want or need out of the relationship because they've developed block care. So now they're ready to throw in the towel and just disrupt, and says, you know, say this child needs to go. And we often, so that's why children who are suspected of having attachment disorders or have been diagnosed with them get into that ping-ponging around from family to family to family to family until they kind of burn through them. Delaware is a small state. We don't have that many available. And then now all of a sudden we're looking at, we don't have any resource families who are willing to parent them. Okay, so if we talk about diagnosing reactive attachment disorders, so children are typically diagnosed with RAD between the ages of 9 months and 5 years. This is really important to remember. This is typically a diagnosis that is made very early. Now, in my experience, and I'm sure in yours, you have children who are diagnosed at a much older age with reactive attachment disorders. And we can talk about like why that is. But typically they are diagnosed between 9 months and 5 years. So here's just some general guidelines. The child can appear sad or fearful, not respond when their caregiver tries to make them feel better. Those are some really broad parameters. The child must also have, and this is a critical part of it, they have to have experienced serious abuse and neglect, multiple changes in caregivers, have lived in institutionalized care early in their life, or have a pain that cannot be soothed at an early age. This is one that is often overlooked. If a child is in a hospital as an infant or is very sickly as an infant, that child can then develop attachment barriers because they can't be soothed. The caregiver, no matter how much the caregiver tries, can't make that pain go away. So there are reasons besides just abuse and neglect that can cause issues and barriers to attachment. So this is critical to know that not all children who have experienced abuse or neglect develop reactive attachment disorders. We have to be careful when clinicians diagnose reactive attachment disorder that they're not over-diagnosing it. It's like, oh, this child had abuse and neglect in their history, so therefore they must have reactive attachment disorder. We need to look at what is that clinician's, percentage of diagnosing this. If it's a very high percent of children in foster care who they're giving, assigning this diagnosis to, that's a red flag. Not all children who have experienced trauma or struggle with behavior problems will have an attachment disorder. Okay, so we have to remember that you are in a unique, I'm going to keep stressing this over and over again, you as CASAs, you're in a unique position to put the brakes on some of this and say, what are we really looking at? Where's this diagnosis coming from? What is this clinician's, history with diagnosing attachment issues? What is the child's history? And what are we doing with that? Autism can resemble reactive attachment disorders. That should always be looked at. Just, take a look at that just automatically to make sure that it's not being misdiagnosed as reactive attachment disorders. Okay. So how common are we really talking about? It is considered rare. True reactive attachment disorder is rare. So if you have a high percentage of kids that you are working with who have that diagnosis, something's breaking down in the chain. And we need to relook at that on a case-by-case basis. So here are some statistics. Statistics are always, ever evolving. It depends on what source you're getting them from. But I did want to just try to throw a few statistics in for you. So an estimated 10% of severely abused children. Okay, so it's a very small population of children who experience abuse, and then a very small part of that population. Some children may exhibit symptoms that like those seen with RAD, but in a milder form. In this case, they could be just struggling with another type of attachment disorder. I just threw in some of the words you may see attached to a child. It could be insecure attachment, disorganized attachment, avoidant attachment, ambivalent attachment. All of those mean different things. It does not mean a reactive attachment disorder, okay? So approximately 2% of the US population have joined families through adoption, and between 50 and 80% of such children suffer from attachment disorder symptoms, not diagnoses, because of early maltreatment in the form of abuse and neglect. 38% of children in foster care before the age of 4 years due to abuse or neglect had signs of reactive attachment disorder, but do they truly have it? Most children will form some type of attachment to their caregiver somewhere along the way, even if that attachment is fragile. And that's important to remember. It is really rare for a child to have a history of complete unattachment. Okay. So here's a critical piece. Almost all children will be able to form relational attachments, but the quality of those attachments is dependent on the child's caregiver. It's the quality we're talking about. So it's extremely, extremely rare for a child to not be able to form some type of attachment. But it's that quality. It's the degree of it. A child will still form a bond with neglectful or abusive caregivers, but that bond will become insecure as a child's needs are inconsistently or repeatedly not met. This can cause the child to struggle with forming secure attachments to attuned and receptive caregivers in the future. Remember, we talked about that. They could have that blocked trust and that safety blindness. Separation from loving caregivers or a series of inconsistent caregivers can also break trust formed in infancy and in early childhood, leading to insecure attachments. When a child is deprived of a secure attachment with a consistent and loving caregiver, which really should say attuned, they are at greater risk for developing emotional and behavioral problems as a result. Attachment struggles can include insecure, indiscriminate, disorganized attachment. Again, those are some of the terms that you will see that are used and do not necessarily mean a true reactive attachment disorder. So here's our continuum of attachment. We have children who have less secure attachment to more secure attachment. We, at the very, very end, we have children who have truly unattached, barriers, and then they can go to disorganized, ambivalent, anxious, all the way up to healthy attachment, all those other words in between. So again, just try to remember that it is rare. When children do not have secure attachment, they can survive, but they're not thriving emotionally. It undermines their ability to form secure attachment with future caregivers because a child has learned that their world is unpredictable, unsafe. They cannot trust adults to meet their needs, and they devote their attention and energy to survival and safety. That is where their focus is. It can lead to disorganized behaviors where children appear, they don't know how to get their needs met. So they can look and act out of control and have difficulty regulating their emotions and behaviors and can't express what they need. So when you ask a kid, what would you need? What would help? They can't articulate it. It takes their energy away from typical important activities of exploring and playing. It's where you have the kids who are really doing poorly in school. How can they concentrate on their multiplication facts when they're really focused, hyper aroused on survival? They learned at an early age that their best strategy for being in a relationship is to hide your needs and feelings behind a mask of detachment. So we want to be really careful of those babies who are good babies. When a baby joins a family, a resource family, and they're like, oh, it's such a good baby. It never cries. I can just lay it in the crib and, it doesn't fuss. That is actually a huge, huge red flag. That means that child has learned that an adult is not going to meet their needs and they've given up. Similarly, when you have an older child, we all know about children who act out and express those behaviors that get a lot of attention. But when you have that child who's too good, who just kind of flies under the radar, and has learned that detachment, and that their best way of survival is to keep a low profile, that's really harder actually to address, because they often get overlooked, because they don't create any waves. People often equate stability with psychological health, and that's not true. So if you have a child who you're working with who is almost too good, that's a red flag. So these children may have display avoidant behaviors. It's likely they were punished for expressing their needs, and that despite their ability to look self-sufficient, they do need to be protected, nurtured, and valued. Other children can appear to be anxious and clingy and very needy. You'll see on the LOCs, the levels of care that go out, craves excess attention. That's a common one. Okay, that's another red flag for you to look at. They may have experienced some difficulties with attachment, but they're preoccupied with not being left alone and ensuring that their needs are met. So these may be kids who experienced being left alone a lot, or have had multiple separations where their needs were not met. So their survival skills is to make sure their needs are met. So that craving, again, when we say craves excess attention, it blames the child. And instead of looking at what is actually driving those perceptions and belief, why is that child needing, so much attention and care from the caregiver? So we want to know, why would children not be happy for getting away from caregivers who would hurt them? So instead, kids, instead of having, experiencing that feeling of gratefulness, this is a problem with resource parents. They're like, that child should be grateful for everything I'm doing for them. Instead, the children can be angry when they join a family, even though they're with a safe and nurturing family. And so we have to understand that, the environment from which the child has come from is what's familiar for them. That is what is, typical, normal for them. It could be that the child blames themselves, and that the only attention they received was in the form of some sort of abuse. And we want to remember that it is extremely rare for for parents to be abusive 24/7. Most parents don't wake up in the morning and say, what can I do today to harm my child? It's intermittent, and they have periods of where they are able to be loving to their children. And so when a child is separated from their parent, it is very, very, very rare. Only once in my experience did I ever experience a child who said, what took you so long? And every other child has always wanted to rejoin their family, regardless of the circumstances of which the family was living. So what are some risks for other struggles if a child is struggling with attachment? So young children who have been neglected or abused may also have developmental or physical delays. Older children may be at risk for disorders, including eating disorders, anger issues, depression, anxiety problems in school, and drug and alcohol abuse. If you are working with a child who displays any of these, take a look at what may have happened with the infant attachment cycle. We need to remember that core self-beliefs drive behavior. The perceptions and beliefs of what the child's world lens is what drives their behavior. If we keep looking at the behavior and hammering away at the behavior, oh, the child lies, the child steals, and we don't get to what is underlying the core self-beliefs and their perceptions that is driving that, we're not going to make any progress. We're just going to keep hammering away at those behaviors, and we're not going to make any actual headway in actually changing those behaviors. Again, we can get caught up in that stability is what we're aiming for, and it's not. Stability is great, and it helps children remain with resource parents who are not trauma informed, but it is not it is not what we're aiming for, because we need to help children while we can, while we have the supports in place, while we are all involved with them. Because if we just keep them stable until they exit foster care, then you get children who are now, you know, going to be dependent on a lot of other ways of that won't serve their best interest. They'll get involved with the penal system. They'll have early families. You know, they'll have start families of their own at a young age. The alcohol and drug abuse. You know, those are the things. So we need to really, you know, insert the thought of what are we doing for these children while we still can. Children can become afraid to take safe risks. They can have that learned helplessness. An incorrect diagnosis can lead to a lack of support services. And if a child is misdiagnosed prior to the age of 18, they can be denied services that they need. They won't get disability. So if a child is misdiagnosed with a conduct disorder or oppositional defiant disorder, it can stop their ability from getting disability assistance. Why is that? Because if we can appropriately diagnose a child, one thing I'm going to get into is that prenatal exposure is critical to diagnosis. If we can't look at what prenatal exposure may have done for a child's development, then they can get mislabeled. They can get this conduct disorder, this oppositional defiant disorder, and then they can't get, when they're an adult, they can't get disability insurance assistance, not insurance, sorry, disability assistance, because they will have been given the wrong a diagnosis. And then we've got a lot of kids who end up in the penal system. So children with a diagnosis of reactive attachment disorder can appear typical in some settings and not in the home setting. So you can have, the resource parents who say, well, they hold it together all day at school. Why can't they do it at home? Well, that's actually pretty typical. So here's a list of symptoms, and then we're going to talk about like what exactly does that mean. So you'll hear, these descriptions: avoids eye contact, indiscriminate affection with strangers, not affection on the parent's terms. That's a biggie. Destructive to self, others, or things, cruelty to animals, lying, stealing, no impulse control, hypervigilant, hyperactive. That's a biggie, the hyperactive. Learning delays, lack of conscience, no remorse. That's a huge one. Abnormal eating patterns, hoarding food. Here's another huge one. Poor peer relationships, preoccupation of fire, violence, weapons, concept of evil, persistence, nonsense, questions, and chatter. Oh my goodness. That's another big one. Inappropriate demands and clinging, again, abnormal speech patterns. So we can't just jump to reactive attachment disorder with this list of symptoms. So many of these overlap with prenatal alcohol exposure. And we are not looking at that enough. We are looking at things, after the child is born, and we are shifting that blame to the child. We really, really need to look at that prenatal alcohol and drug exposure. That causes a change in their brain development before they're even born. And they have neurological issues that cannot be changed with medication or behavior modification. If you have brain injury, which is what that is, if you have neurological development, holes in that neurological development, and if you get into brain science, you can actually see it on MRIs comparisons. You cannot think that you are going to fix this with medication and behavior modification. And unfortunately, that is the treatment of default for children in foster care. And the huge majority of children who enter into foster care have had some type of not the best prenatal care. The mom may not have known she was pregnant. Even when she says, oh, I stopped drinking as soon as I knew I was pregnant. Well, when did you know? 6 weeks in, 8 weeks in, to 12 weeks in, and again, rather than blaming the mom, we need the mom to help us understand what may have happened during that critical period of prenatal development so that we can get the right diagnoses for children. Because if we just look at this list of diagnoses that is used to diagnose reactive attachment disorder, we are completely missing the ball. And the child will not get the correct supports. The child will not be able to be successful, and we're going to end up blaming the child. Okay. And this is, as a CASA, this is really critical that you take the time and effort to look at what could be some of those factors that need to be teased out between prenatal development and then attachment. Okay. So when children who are diagnosed with a reactive attachment disorder get older, they can follow a couple different patterns. And you may recognize some of this in children that you work with. There's inhibited reactive attachment disorder, where the child is more detached, unresponsive. They hold back their emotions, withdrawal. They don't seek affection, a tendency to keep to themselves, as opposed to disinhibited reactive attachment disorders, where they're indiscriminate and they have an inappropriate familiarity with their choice of attachment figures, no preference for caregivers, and a tendency to act younger than their age, and seek affection in potentially dangerous ways. And of course, I'm sure we can all think of kids who we work with who could fit one of these or another. Again, just looking at, general symptoms that are used when people talk about reactive attachment disorder. We can't talk about attachment if we don't talk about the children who spend significant time in residential treatment centers. So many of the kids we work with end up at Kids Peace or other out of state. Delaware is a very small state. A lot of kids end up going because, as we talked about before, children who have this blocked trust and then get into a cycle with caregivers where they get blocked care and they start ping-ponging to family after family after family. They can then be like, well, they've run through all of our options in Delaware. Now we're looking at Kids Peace or something similar. I'm just picking Kids Peace out of the air. There's certainly many, 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 many ones that I'm sure we've all had experience with. But that's one that, Delaware often uses is for a residential treatment center for children who have not been successful in a family setting. So institutional care can shape a child's early life and attachment to a worker, not a family. Again, there's a lot of this data was pulled out of children who grew up in orphanages, but it is true for kids who experience other types of institutional care. The child could have a preferred caregiver or two, but it is not, they're not expected to love them and be part of their lives, right? There's kind of that safety boundary. I don't have to get in too deep. This results in them developing a comfort with living in an institutional setting. It's not expected to them to go to that deeper level that is required when you are in a family setting. Children in foster care who exhibit maladaptive behavior can experience cycles of going in and out of crisis or residential institutional settings. The child may feel safer without the expectation or perceived risk to form deeper relationships. So children can become more comfortable in institutional care. They learn what they need to do. Again, these survival skills that will have them returned to institutional care. Where they are more comfortable and where the demands of coming out of their survival zone, out of that block trust is not expected of them. And then again, we run the risk if we don't address this when the kids are in, when they're minors. When they become adults, then the only way that they know how to function comfortably is to be in institutional care, and that's usually the penal system, right? So that's how we can have kids who become very comfortable with the penal system, and then show they don't care if they keep racking up charges and things like that. So this is very, very important. Reactive attachment disorders happen within a relationship, so the treatment must occur within a relationship. You can't do this with medication. You can't do this with a behavior modification approach. You can have the child attend individual therapy, but it will not be successful with a child who truly has an attachment disorder of any type, unless you involve the family. And that can be the resource family. But you have to have a resource family that understands attachment issues and that is willing to participate. Many resource families want to drop the kid off and go shopping while the kid's in therapy, pick the kid up and the kid be fixed. And that again is getting back to this putting out fires approach to therapy, rather than getting to the perceptions and beliefs that are driving that behavior and looking at that attachment cycle. If the attachment cycle was not met when the child was an infant in those early years, it must now be met at whatever age they are. Children cannot give what they never got. So they can't give in that reciprocal relationship, learn it. And if they didn't develop trust as an infant. And again, we can get into blaming the child for this. And you'll get into the children where, the meds just keep getting multiplied or upped in order to try to manage behavior. And medication management can be helpful for children who are exhibiting, really strong behaviors, but it can't be the treatment. It's a crutch. It can be a crutch while the child is working on the relational work that needs to be done, but it can't be an end all be all. Okay. So there are many parenting techniques, which we don't have time really to get into too much, that help with children with attachment struggles. A basic one being you never, ever use time out, you use time in. That's just a basic one. That attunement, that meeting the attachment cycle, even if the child's 16, you still got to meet that attachment cycle. What does that look like in a 16-year-old? Not pathologizing the behavior, not calling it the conduct disorders and oppositional defiant disorders. Constantly telling the child that, I am able to, keep you safe. I will keep you safe. Being light and playful. When the child's doing well, staying within their ear sight, making sure their needs are met, understanding some of the resultant behaviors from children who have come from abuse and neglect. Giving kids choices and a voice as much as possible. Allowing do-overs, so that you can model ways for that relation development. If the child, you have to create that motor memory for positive relational interactions. So allowing the child to have a do-over, modeling a do-over if the parent didn't do something. I don't want to use the word appropriately, but there are parents aren't perfect, So parents make mistakes when they're hungry, tired, and sick themselves. So being able to say, I'm sorry, and asking for and doing a do-over is critical for parents to do so that they can model that for the child. Providing sensory experiences, co-regulation precedes self-regulation. So if the child can't self-regulate, the parent needs to be able to understand what is co-regulation and to participate in that with the child before expecting the child to be able to self-regulate. When a child experiences good care and has that attachment cycle met over and over and over, then the pathways start to change, right? And then the pathways can be rebuilt. They may never reach 100% of where they could have been if they hadn't experienced abuse and neglect, but you can improve a child's neural pathways. But you have to repeatedly do that attunement, misattunement, repair cycle, where the resource parent is willing to engage in that relationship repair work. There's I'm not going to pronounce it right. It's DD It's a different form. A lot of our kids get CBT, cognitive behavior therapy. That's pretty standard therapy that children in foster care get. But there's dyadic developmental psychotherapy, which really is what works with the block trust and the block care. But again, you have to have a therapist who knows how to do it, and you also have to have a family who is willing to participate in it. And it uses something called PACE, which is playfulness, acceptance, curiosity, and empathy. It's a really, really great form of therapy and has shown to be really successful with kids with attachment issues. But again, kind of the default here in Delaware is CBT, which is not very good with attachment issues. So children will most always be able to form secure attachments with their permanent caregivers when given enough time, care, and consistency, except in the most extreme situations. Need to provide support to a child who's struggling to form healthy bonds of attachment. This can take an emotional toll on parents who are eager to have their love reciprocated. So we really need to make sure that the parents have training and that they have support in place to help them. They need to do self-care. They need to do couples therapy in order to preserve their marital relationship while they're working with children who have joined their family with attachment issues. It takes love time. And most importantly, consistency to help children understand they will not be let down again, because every single time a child joins a family and then is separated, that's another layer to their trauma history. And you were just reinforcing their core self-beliefs that they are unloved, unwanted. And so, we're actually compounding. We're on the hurting side now, not the helping side. We always want to be on the helping side and not the hurting side. But every single time a child joins and separates, it's just reinforcing their negative core self-beliefs. Children who have repeatedly been neglected by past caregivers or who have experienced multiple temporary caregivers may not always express their needs in a typical way. So again, we need to understand it's important we shift our mind from what is that child doing to what is that child saying. Okay, so if you're working with a child and you're hearing things like that child is manipulative, or that child is ungrateful, that child's disrespectful, what is that child trying to say? Not what is that child doing? Okay, what are the perceptions and beliefs that are driving that behavior? What can we do in order to get to that? As opposed to just, trying to, take more privileges away. You're talking with children who, they've already experienced, the worst of the worst. They're not going to care, and you get that child that, like, it doesn't matter what we do. They just don't care. Well, they really don't. What is that telling you? Right? If you take all these privileges away and they still don't care, well, that they're really telling you something. So it's important to remain sensitive and responsive to their needs consistently. So this is a tool that we use a lot in order to understand a child that has experienced abuse and neglect. We do what's called a child strength and needs jigsaw puzzle. Every child has 9 areas of child development. And it is really important to understand that a child who has not had their needs met in the attachment cycle are not going to develop in the same way that a child who has. So they have a chronological age, and they typically their physical appearance may or may not match their chronological age, but they also have a social age, a cognitive age, an emotional age, a school age, a gender identification, sexual orientation. And then we need to look at their ethnic match, years of shared customs, values, and traditions. And so we look at all of that, and that helps us understand the children that we are asking resource parents to parent. So if you have a child who is 10, but she looks 14, and she can act anywhere from an infant, right? Because infancy is where we develop attachment and trust. And if they don't trust adults, then they're already can go all the way down emotionally to an infancy stage. And then sometimes they can act 18. Well, now we've got a kid where it's very typical for the kids that we work with. And it's like, you'll hear people saying, well, that child should act their age, or that child acts 18, I'm going to treat them like they're 18. Or we get into, risks of child, human trafficking, because the child looks they're 14, but they're really 10, but their emotional age is really down around 5. Well, they're very ripe to be a victim. So we have to understand all of these different pieces, and the fact that it is incongruent, and that any time a resource parent can be parenting any one of like 9 different children based on what's going on in the moment. And if they don't understand this, and if they're not prepared to meet the needs of that child at the age that child is at that moment, they're not going to be successful. So we have to make sure that we that we can help those resource parents, understand this and meet the needs of what we call jigsaw children. And all the children in foster care are jigsaw children to one extent or another. So when we get to this distress relief cycle that we talked about, we like to tell resource parents to think of this as a clock. So up here we have distress at 12 o'clock. Then if you anticipate the needs and you're attuned, that's at when the child is crying, that's at that 3 o'clock. And then down at 6 o'clock, we can meet the needs. Over at 9 o'clock, we're starting to build that attachment until there's another need up at that 12 o'clock. So if you can help, if you can think of, and if you can help people think of this as an actual clock, the 12, 3, 6, and 9, we can help them understand that attachment cycle. At 12 o'clock, there's a need. 3 o'clock, they're vocal about that need in some way, or even non-verbally. Then down at 6 o'clock, we are tuned, we meet that need. Then over at that 9 o'clock, that's where we're getting that trust built. But we get into this thing called the 4 o'clock hour. So if you go back up to our clock here, and you think of this as 12, 3, 6, and 9, right here, we've got that 4 o'clock hour. It's at that 4 o'clock hour that resource parents think they need to do something, right? That's when they need to be like, act your age, stop having a tantrum. You're going to lose they start taking privileges away, whatever it is. But they do it at this 4 o'clock. And at this point, it's the child is in their survival brain, not their thinking brain. And you're off to the races. You're actually going to escalate the situation. If the caregiver can be attuned, meet the child's needs, and reserve the intervention until they're over here at this 9 o'clock, that's when the teaching and learning can happen. If you hammer away at this 4 o'clock, it's not going to happen. The child will just become more entrenched and will escalate. You will escalate. And now you've got a situation that is just going to perhaps lead to, that's when you get those situations where, things get broken and somebody gets hurt, or, it escalates to where you need to call crisis. So what will it take in a resource family? 3 things: the ability, resources, and willingness. So when we assess families, we look at what is their ability, what are their resources, and what are their willingness. The key is willingness. That has to come from the family. The only thing we can do to help with willingness is support the family. Make sure they're taking time for themselves to relax and recharge. Make sure that they're in some sort of couples therapy, or that they're understanding they really need to be in tune with their partner in order to, remain able to do this work for the kids. We can't fix the willingness once it's not there. What we can do, if the family is willing, is that we can look at their ability and their resources. We can help boost their ability by providing the resources. So we always have to assess for willingness. That is number one. We ask, if your life depended on it, could you continue? If the family says yes, then we know we need to, circle the wagons, get the resources to enhance their ability. If the family says no, now we need to reshift our focus to circling the wagons around the child. And how are we going to try to minimize yet another disruption and yet another layer to their trauma history? So when we look at parents, caregivers, we want to think of them, are they trying to be mechanics, or are they trying to be gardeners? What do we want from a resource parent? And unfortunately, I'm going really fast through a lot of this stuff because we only have an hour, and I want to be respectful of your time. We're down to like the last 5 minutes. So I'm really hustling here. So we really want them to be a gardener. And we could have a whole discussion about this, but it is because if a child is an orchid, we can't fix them and make them a rose. Right? We can help nurture them and help them grow to be the best orchid they can be, but we cannot transform them into a rose. And that is really important for us to understand. So if you want to drop a child off at therapy to be fixed, it will not work. This happened in a relationship and needs to be, reworked. The therapy has to take work in a relationship. We cannot be mechanics, swoop in and fix this kid, right? So we have to provide the best nurturing environment, the best relational work that we can for the child in order to help them grow and flourish to their best potential. Again, we can help them rebuild their neural pathways. Will they reach 100% of where they could be if they had good genes, great prenatal care, and the best parenting? No, but we can help them reach what their greatest potential is. Okay. So here's some resources that, I just used to put this PowerPoint together. And I have just fired off a whole lot of stuff at you. And but I want to be respectful of your time. We have 4 minutes left. We could do, an all-day training on this. So I'm hoping that what the first degree of learning is awareness. So if I have just brought your attention and awareness to some of these issues, then we've accomplished what I hoped, and what I think when Lauren contacted me, what I think maybe she wanted me to do. I can't provide you with every solution to every situation in an hour, but it's you as CASAs, you are frontline workers for these kids. For you to really take a hard look at what are the perceptions and beliefs? What was the prenatal care? What was the attachment cycle? What are the diagnoses? What kind of therapy is this child receiving? What are the clinicians who are making these diagnoses? What is their background in training? What are we doing with medication management? What is the purpose? What are the expectations of medication management? These are all the questions as CASAs that you are in such a great, unique position to take a look at and help these kids get the best supports and treatment we can get them before they exit the foster care system and are now left to their own devices. Out there without our support. So, okay. So if you have any comments, questions, or whatever, please feel free.
Yeah, Lynn, that was fantastic. Actually, if you stop sharing your screen, then we can see our attendees if you want.
Thank you. I'm so sorry.
No, oh my gosh, that was great. And I know you were going so fast. I should have given you like a whole day. I mean, you make me think about some future trainings we could have, because all of this information was super, super helpful and real. And I'm thinking of a couple of classes that I have that will absolutely benefit from this.
I have a question. Is there an age? I mean, this is so fundamental in development. Is there an age at which it's almost irretrievable that a child is gone without trusting somebody, and they say if it hasn't developed by this age, the chances of succeeding in correcting the situation is almost impossible.
So you have, unfortunately, adults, right? You have people who have grown up and didn't get the supports and assistance they needed in order to change. So you have adults then. And so my answer is going to be no, because it's rare. It's very rare. Okay. Please keep that word rare in your mind. So of course you can never talk in absolutes. So is there a child somewhere that, maybe, yeah. But it's the older they get, the harder it is. That's the concept to keep in mind. So even an adult can make progress, but they're going to have to be like, you're going to have to like have some really supportive therapy and really good relationships and really go back and almost reparent that person, from the beginning. So I'm going to say no, because it does get harder. So we don't want to ever give up on a child. We don't ever want to, throw in the towel and say they're a lost cause. It's really, really rare to have a child who's so pathological. So who's such a has such a predisposition towards something like that no, but it gets harder. It gets harder the older they get, because they have that many more years of their needs not being met.
Yeah, and I just wondered whether there was any, limit that said, if a child grows to 15 years old and the chances of getting through to them are minute.
Well, sure, because now think of that jigsaw puzzle, right? And if you think of typical child development, at the age of 15, children are pulling away from caregivers, right? That's normal development, right? Because they're preparing to be adults and launch and, be on their own. So you have this really, the work actually draws them into the caregiver at a time with normal child development, they're pulling away. So it's harder, but it's not, you have to understand it's really hard work, but we don't ever want to say that we can't make progress for that child. We don't want to go there, because then we end up with people just kind of throwing up their hands, over medicating a child and putting them in an RTC until they age out and then saying good luck, so we don't want to do that.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Lynn, thank you so much. I'll respect your time as well. And thank you for putting all of that information together. This is fantastic. And I feel like I've got all these thoughts and I need to process all this amazing information, because it makes me think, about specific kids and specific cases. And, you still provide a lot of hope. It's not too late, if the right support services are provided.
We're a small state, and we do have some fantastic practitioners in this state, clinicians, but we've got to tap into them, and we have to, we also have to get a shift away from traditional ways that we have worked with kids in foster care in order to, promote the types of therapies and supports that are more successful.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, Lynn, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. We really appreciate it.
Yep. Enjoy your day.